network manager within Eurocontrol. Thank you for being with us to inform the members of the Parliament of the position of Eurocontrol regarding the airspace safety. And first of all, I would ask you to give us a short introduction. We received your note yesterday and today about what you said on paper. A short introduction of a few minutes. On my left side, your right side, is Mr. Van Bommel from the Socialist Party. He is raising his hand. On the right side, Mr. Ten Broeke from the Liberal Party, Mr. Omtzigt from the Christian Democrat Party, and Mr. Savaat from the Social Democrat Party. You have now the opportunity to give a short introduction of a few minutes, and then the members have their questions to you. Go ahead, Mr. Sultan.
Yes, thank you. So good evening to all. As I said in my short written note, I'm Joe Sultan. I'm the Director Network Manager within Eurocontrol. My background, I've been with Eurocontrol 24 years. I come from Malta, originating from Malta. But I have, as I said, working at Eurocontrol for the last 24 years. And since 2.5 years, I've been the Director Network Manager. The Network Manager has responsibilities looking at the operation of the European system as a whole. It works in partnership with the service providers, including the Dutch service provider, looking at each part of the airspace, how it is functioning and how we can improve the performance to aircraft operators using the European system. On a day-to-day, that is done on a day-to-day basis. I have an operational unit working H24 all the year round, which deals with flow and capacity management, so deals with delays and tries to mitigate against those delays. At the same time, we have an overview of what's happening across the European system. Specifically in context of the tragic MH17 incident, we also look at, as part of our process, we receive flight plans of flights, and we check those flight plans against publicized NOTAMs of information about airspace closures, etc. So in this case, for example, we have received the flight plan. We distribute that flight plan to all the air traffic control centers who need it for the follow-up of that flight and for the air traffic control of that flight, after having checked against airspace closures that were applicable at that time. In the attachment that I have sent to you also as an example of what we do. So sorry, I just go one step back. When I talked about the performance of the network, a major disruption and crisis is certainly has a big impact on the performance of the network. So as the network manager, we have a role in acting when there is a major disruption, mitigating its impact, and when the disruption is over, we try to recover the system, the aviation system, as quickly as possible. If there's a crisis situation, then we have a coordinating role as part of the European Aviation Crisis Coordination Cell, set up after the volcanic ash crisis that was about 4 years ago. So, and I am the chairman of the European Aviation Crisis Coordination Cell, set up when there is a crisis. I think in the context of MH17, the other point I want to make is that given this role that we have both as Eurocontrol and as specifically as the network manager, I represented Eurocontrol in the ICAO task force on conflict zones, which was set up immediately in the aftermath of that, and took part in the work of that task force, which was chaired by Mr. David Macmillan, who had been before Director General of Eurocontrol.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
No, I think I was going to conclude by saying I'm available to respond to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sultana. Then the floor is to Mr. Vaas from the Social Democrat Party for his first question. Please answer the question after the first question, direct an answer, and then we start with the second question. It's the best way to do this with this video conference. So, Mr. Savas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, sir, for your introduction and for the information you provided to us. Maybe to start with a factual question. In the statement that Eurocontrol issued immediately after the downing of MH17, the day after actually, on the 18th of July, your organization stated that Eurocontrol does not have the means nor the mandate to take decisions on the situation in Ukraine. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, where the borders of your mandate and means then are, both in geographical terms and in, you know, what you can do in a country such as Ukraine?
Mr. Sultana.
Yes, so from a geographical area point of view, the Ukraine and Ukrainian airspace is part of an airspace for which Eurocontrol, it's a member state of Eurocontrol, and its airspace is part of the operation that is also part of the network manager. So from a geographical area, we are involved and address also that airspace. I think when we mentioned the means and mandate, means was the ability that we had, the access to information by which we could make a judgment as to whether the airspace was safe to fly or not. And I think that was what we meant at that time with the means. The second point about the mandate is, even if we had that information, we would not have had the mandate to close that airspace, because any closure of airspace would have been is the prerogative of the state involved, in this case Ukraine, unless it is over the high seas, where then there's an ICAO responsibility for airspace over the high seas. So that was what meant at that time between means as regards information that we had to our access to information, and any information that we had received which somehow could have made us act differently from what we have had. And the second point would have been a mandate to do something such as closing of airspace. It does not mean that if we had information that we felt what was considered impacting the safety of flight, that we would not inform the authority of the state concerned of that information. So the information would have been shared should we have had that information.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sultana. One more explaining question from Mr. Sultana.
Well, just one short follow-up question. What sort of information would you say, in hindsight, did you miss? There has been a lot of debates in this country whether certain information was available. Did you do your own evaluation in the sense of was there information that was lacking from your system? Or was your analysis of the information that was available not correct?
Mr. Sultana?
No, I think the issue was the information available to us. The only information that we had was something that was in the public knowledge. From the news, we know there was a conflict zone. We know that there were conflict in the region, in eastern part of Ukraine. But it is what you get from the TV, from news on TV. We have no possibility, and we are not part of an intelligence gathering information or receipt of intelligence information, which would give us more precise information as, for example, what type of weapons are in a certain area or others. So we don't have that information, and there is no means within our current structure for us to get that information.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Omtzigt from the Christian Democrat Party for his question.
In December 2014, the Sunday Times reported that a number of experts from Eurocontrol, days before the downing of MH17, had talks with the Ukrainian air traffic control and asked and warned them about the dangers, since it had been in public knowledge, as you just told us, that almost 20 planes had been shot down, a bit lower than commercial traffic, but there was obviously a war going on in the air over eastern Ukraine. What was the nature of those talks, and how did the Ukrainian side respond at that time to the worries that were expressed by Eurocontrol?
Mr. Zoltana?
We have also seen these reports, these press reports. I have no, and at senior level at Eurocontrol, we have no knowledge of this contact between any Eurocontrol expert and the Ukrainian authorities. So I cannot give more information as to whether this, first of all, this encounter took place and what was exchanged, because following this press report, we have tried to look at who in our daily contacts in the staff has had these meetings, or if there was such a meeting, and we have not been able to identify anyone who has had these meetings. So I don't have, as responsible for the network manager, for my experts, I do not have any information on this, and I was a bit surprised also by this report, because, as I mentioned, we do not have access to the information that could have indicated that there was conflict more than what we had from the public media.
Thank you very much. Following question from Mr. Omtzigt.
What kind of internal... a different question. We are faced in the Dutch Safety Board report that there was the primary radar was under maintenance. Yet, if we look at the publicity, quite a bit of primary radar stations in the east of Ukraine had been destroyed. Was Ukraine under an obligation to report to Eurocontrol if primary or secondary radar isn't working? And did it make any reports in the months of May, June and July 2014 to Eurocontrol about problems with its radar surveillance, which could obviously impact air traffic control?
Mr. Sultana?
Yes. It is the procedure that should any infrastructure, any equipment, so I would include radar as part of this group of equipment, which has a bearing, an impact on the provision of air traffic control, in particular whether they could handle the amount of traffic that is expected in their airspace. That information is required by Eurocontrol, by our unit. I do not put it just in the context of MH17, but even in a normal day-to-day situation, if the ability of an air traffic service provider, which declares to us the amount of aircraft they can handle in a certain hour, and that it is our obligation then to make sure that the aircraft that are into that airspace are within these limits. If these capacity limits, if I can put it on this, the capacity level, for whatever reason is changed, and one of the main reasons for its change would have been a radar outage, because certainly a radar outage means that they can handle less aircraft than they normally do, then that information needs to be given to us.
Sorry.
So I have no information that during those months there was any degradation of the radar system enough for the Ukrainian authorities to decrease the number of aircraft that they could handle from an air traffic control perspective.
Can we is there public access to the information of the notifications that Ukraine made to Eurocontrol on its availability of radar data, or would you be able to send the public information on that to the Dutch Parliament so that we know what they publicly stated?
Yes, we are in a position to indicate for the months you request whether there was any declaration of a degradation of service which we received for those 3 months, and we can make it available.
Thank you.
Mr. Ten Broeke from the Liberal Party.
Okay. Thank you for that, sir. Let me continue now on what your role could be in with consideration to the recommendations of the Dutch Safety Board. Joe Sultana, who we just spoke to, explained that Mr. Macmillan, your predecessor that we talked to, explained to us that Eurocontrol is an ideal platform to make recommendations and to deal with best practices, but it's essentially an intergovernmental organization that is not capable of making hard law. You yourself said that you're looking into flight plans and NOTAMs. We're happy to receive those that are interested for us over the 3 months period that you just described. And you look at all the information in the public domain. What could we more expect, or what kind of task could we submit to Eurocontrol in order to increase security over in airspaces that are not fully under the control of the authorities, even when they think they might still be in control?
Mr. Sultana?
I think the biggest role that we can play, is in receiving risk assessments that any state may have of its own airspace or also of other airspaces, which would help in the airlines who eventually have to fly plan over these airspaces to make the best assessment possible and take the right decision based on those risks. What we do already, what we did 3 months after the incident, so in November 2014, we started the publication of an airspace closure and warning summary, as I have sent in the attachment to my contribution to before this video conference. It is an example of what we started, as I said, in November 2014. The intention is to gather all the information possible that is public, that is issued by any relevant authority for any airspace in Europe and adjoining airspace where we see a lot of flights from Europe going in and out of. The intention is to first of all put it all together, because even today, despite what ICAO have introduced, this website, this web space where states put information, this is not really yet populated enough for it to be of a good enough guidance to the airspace users who have to plan their operations on a daily basis. So basically what we have done is we monitor all the NOTAMs for all the airspaces in Europe and or surrounding airspace which would have an impact, and then we depict it and advise airspace users which routes they can use or not use, subject as a result of these routes, as a result of these NOTAMs. So there's a role we play in having collected and passing the operational advice to airspace users, which route is possible, under which level, what alternatives there are, etc. But that is maybe after the event. That is once the NOTAM has been published. What we would like to do is also before. If any risk assessment has been made nationally, we are the ideal, I think, operational unit, because this needs an operational unit to implement, because this is a live situation. It can change from 1 minute to another, and you cannot wait until the next day to update this closure or warning, I would say, picture. So we have the operational unit ready to take on board any risk assessment and share it with the airlines and with other parties which are interested. We would certainly not, and I think this is one of the issues which has prevented this from happening. We do not want to know the intelligence sources which lead to the assessment, but it would be, I think, important for airspace users to know that a state has received and has issued an information about an airspace which is relevant maybe to its national carrier, and it should be relevant to all. So I think having received the risk assessment and making sure that this is seen by others who need it, also to make their own assessment or to complement it, but even just take it into account, is an important contribution that I think we can add, something which was certainly not present in July 2014.
Thank you, Mr. Sultana. Then it's the floor to Mr. Van Bommel for his question.
Mr. Sultana, you said that your organization does not have a mandate to close the airspace above countries, but you can urge national governments to close the airspace. Now, at the time that MH17 was down, we already knew there was some 20 aircraft shot by whatever party. That knowledge must have been available to you and to your organization. Would that not be enough to urge the Ukrainian government to close its airspace entirely, because it only closed it until 9,700 meters?
Mr. Sultana.
I think in order to make such a recommendation, such an advice, I think the word you used was urge a state, we would have to have, I would say, more information than any state had at that time about the situation over Ukraine, for example. We do not feel that it is that we had more information than was public knowledge at that time for any state, any airline, to have made a different judgment should they have received a further recommendation from us. So what the policy that we had is, how can we help in this? Do we have more information that is not available to others? If that is the case, certainly we would make that information available. It is our obligation to make it. If we, out of that new information, we could even make even a recommendation, I think we would do it as well. But making a recommendation based on information coming from the news, from a television reporter, not even directly to us, but just we happen to see it, we do not feel that this is adding to the information that a state would have, and would not be given enough credibility to it for it to make any change in the decision process.
But if you allow me, in the case of Ukraine, it would be against the interest of the country itself, should the government close the airspace entirely, because it would mean that the Ukrainian government did not have control over the airspace above its own country, and therefore it would give itself a position that it does not have the full sovereignty over the country, and therefore your organization might step in and take that responsibility.
Mr. Sultana, your reaction, please.
I can understand the point you make in the sense that it is possible that a state would have other interests than just the safety of flight in that airspace before for which it makes such a decision. But taking over the responsibility for making that decision, Eurocontrol, as an intergovernmental organization, doesn't have that mandate to take over that decision-making responsibility for that airspace, on the assumption that a state might not be giving safety the top priority, if I can paraphrase a bit the assumption or the scenario that you have. I can maybe give an example of what happened a few weeks later. In Tel Aviv, at the Tel Aviv airport, there were some missiles landing close, rockets landing close to Tel Aviv airport, international airport. There were immediate reactions by a number of states banning their flights, the flights on the register from landing at Tel Aviv. The Israeli authorities went public with a safety assessment which identified the threat, identified what they're doing against that threat, and saying that they did not feel that there was a threat to aircraft landing in Tel Aviv, in Israel. Now, you could say that they did it for their self-interest because of the economic impact of that. But I think they did it correctly in the sense that the risk assessment that they made, the safety risk assessment that they developed, which justified or showed that why they still maintained that their airspace was safe, that their airport was safe, was made available through Eurocontrol, through all the rest of the states. And each state then took that and made their own assessment of whether to ban their aircraft from flying into Tel Aviv. And as a consequence of that, after 2 or 3 days, those states which had banned their aircraft from landing there reversed or gave a new safety information, which allowed these aircraft to operate. So I put it in this context that it is the state concerned which has this responsibility. There are instances when, if you have additional information, that action can be taken, the state concerned would have to, I would say, justify it or not, and the justification would allow the states and the airspace users from in making their final decision to operate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sultan. Mr. Servaas for his second question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We've been talking now to several representatives from international organizations concerning these issues. And you, I think, very clearly described that your organization has certain limitations because it's intergovernmental and because you do not have access to information from intelligence agencies. And now we've spoken... So before this meeting, we've spoken to the director from IATA, Mr. Key from France, and he says, well, his organization does have some supranational aspects because it's based on EU law, some of the things that they are doing, and that they can use certain EU regulation to share information between EU member states intelligence agencies. Would you support his claim, and does that mean that his organization would be best placed to organize a better network of information that could prevent such events in the future?
Mr. Sultana?
I think certainly Mr. Key, as Executive Director for IATA, has responsibilities in relation to safety. Today, their remit is that if they identify a safety risk, they issue a safety information bulletin, which provides the advice of IATA in the context of that airspace and flying there. I think they do not go further today because the European legislation does not allow them to go further today. But it is something that certainly can be changed. We know, because we have discussed with IATA and we have discussed with the European Commission, that there are efforts to have an informal group where the way the risk assessment methodology is done is harmonized, in the sense that so that when a state has done a risk assessment based on sources that it cannot reveal for whatever security reasons, then at least there is an understanding that they've used a methodology which is a common methodology adopted for all the for all EU member states. The ability of the EU and the EASA in particular, but also of the EU or the European Commission, to force a state or to get states to agree to share, I would say, security or confidential information is something that I would say is beyond EASA. It's at political level. And the states have to really agree that. We know that at the moment states are willing to share the outcome of the risk assessments, but there is still reluctance to share information which is then fed into a European risk assessment, if I can put it that way. That is as far as we understand the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Sultana. Then a following question from Mr. Savas, short following question.
Yeah, thank you for that. What exactly is necessary in terms of EU legislation? So what new legislation on harmonizing these issues should be developed to place EASA in an even better position?
Mr. Sultana.
I don't think I have the right legal background to provide to sort of give this legal context or political context also. I think what is important is that any risk assessment that a state makes, that needs to be shared. That's for sure. Because at the end of the day, it is not really that critical of how that state has got that information from. It is important that the information is correctly assessed and then shared. Now, I do not think that requires a huge political change to get the states to share this information, and I think that is the key. It is important that it is not just any risk assessment or any assessment that is made, even about third countries, that is also shared, because that is the basis for an assessment of an airspace in a conflict zone situation where, as you rightly indicated in the report, the state concerned may not have the capability, the expertise, or the desire for internal reasons or political reasons to give exactly, to make this objective safety risk assessment. So I think the most critical part is the obligation to states to share the information.
Thank you very much. Then Mr. Omtzigt for his second question.
Thank you. The DSB had a little bit of information about which airlines chose to fly and chose not to fly over eastern Ukraine. Can you elaborate a bit further from the research that we believe has been done at Eurocontrol on which airlines did use, say in the first half of July, the East Ukrainian airspace, so everything from Crimea to Poland, so the whole length, and which airlines, by their behavior, chose to fly around it?
Mr. Sultana?
Thank you. Yes, the change which happened in the flight paths took place not in July but in March, March-April time, when the airspace over Crimea was closed due to the air traffic control center managed by the Ukrainian authorities had to close and was taken over by the Russian troops or Russian separatists. I do not want to go exactly. I don't know exactly the terminology there. At that point, the Black Sea airspace or the Black Sea airspace or airspace over Crimea, the routes were closed because there was a safety concern that two competing air traffic services would be involved in the same airspace. At that time, we saw some airlines decided to go south, i.e. go further south from Romania, Bulgaria into Turkey, and vice versa, obviously coming the other way, and some airlines going north, i.e. over Ukraine, more on mainland Ukraine, including eastern Ukraine. We saw what we saw, and I can only give an expert view, that the main choice that was made was driven by, I would say, aviation-related conditions, such as obviously, depending on their destination now, which is the shorter route or the less penalizing route. It was based on the weather, especially the winds, which had a significant impact. You have a significant impact as relation to the length of the flight, because clearly now that the aircraft had to move away from their preferred option, which was over Crimea. Some moved north, some moved south. We understand, we also read reports after the incident, over May 17, of a number of airlines saying that in March, April, that they had made the decision based on security information. I cannot judge that. Certainly they did not give that information to us between April and July, and they certainly did not give us a reason for them choosing to fly north over eastern Ukraine or south over Turkey. And looking at the data, because we have seen obviously which flights have flown when over that airspace for the intervening months, April, May, June, July. I think we see only one or two airlines where all their flights went south, i.e. avoided Crimea by going south. Many of the airlines split their operation. Some of them had a majority going south, but a few going over eastern Ukraine. And it's only maybe one or two that really stopped flying from over Crimea and over eastern Ukraine and went south. At that time, we did not question that airline because it was an occurrence which happened over a period of time. But as I said, they did not indicate to us that they were avoiding that airspace over eastern Ukraine due to security reasons.
Very simple question. To be very clear, which two airlines are you talking about?
The one I have in my mind certainly is Qantas. Qantas moved south. I don't have the detail. I can provide that information. I think we've provided to the investigation authorities all the flights which flew in those, but my impression was one or two, one of them being Qantas. And so, yeah.
And the other one, the other airliner?
I don't have that information now.
But if you could provide that together with the other information, if it's public, we would be most grateful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ten Broeke, his second question.
Yeah, Mr. Sultana, since you don't question the choices that the airlines make, I'd like to go into the questioning the air authorities of Ukraine. Crimea was closed because of the danger that was posed, or the risk that was posed by two competing air traffic controls. Eastern Ukraine, however, did not lead to the same decision, although there had at least two competing parties. I wouldn't even call them armies, but that already resulted at that time in 3,000 people dead on the ground, 20 planes being shut down. How would you reflect on that in hindsight with the public information that we all had, that you had? How would you reflect on the decision of the Ukraine authorities not to shut down the airspace over eastern Ukraine?
Mr. Sultana?
The situation of Ukraine, eastern part of Ukraine and Crimea and the Black Sea, the risks were completely different. In the Crimea instance, we had reports from pilots that the Russian authorities were calling them on the frequency and saying, I am the authority now, you have to obey me, I am the air traffic organization dealing with your flight. As soon as we received this information from pilots, we took the action to speak to the Ukrainians. We also spoke to ICAO. Why ICAO? Because the airspace involved, the routes involved, passed over the Black Sea, which is high seas airspace. And so ICAO had a responsibility for that airspace, because at the end of the day, it's their airspace to decide who has the authority to provide air traffic services there. So in that case, we had, I would say, detailed information coming directly to us, both directly from the airlines and also from the Ukrainian authorities. To be fair to the Ukrainian authorities, they were telling us, we have received reports from pilots also that there is an interference, and at that point we made exactly the advice to the Ukrainian authorities and to airlines that this was the situation, and our advice is that this could be something which was unsafe for air traffic.
Yeah.
On the eastern part, on the eastern Ukraine part, I think I repeat what I said before. It's the information that we had was not anything different than what was public knowledge through the news media.
Thank you, Mr. Sultana. A short question. I think
I'd like to probe you a little bit into the second part of my question, and you can understand why. Also because, and I refer now to what my colleague Omtzigt has said before, it was said in the press, although anonymously by people that appear to be in your organization, that there was criticism from people working for you at Eurocontrol for this decision, or for the lack of decisions on the side of the Ukrainians. And now we all have the idea that maybe this whole tragedy might simply have occurred because nobody in their right minds assumed that a passenger airplane would ever be targeted. But that is not the issue that we're trying to find out here. The issue that we're trying to find out here, whether the risks that were already clear and that were in the public knowledge, combined with the decision that was taken on Ukraine, over Crimea, why not a similar decision was taken for Eastern Ukraine?
Clear, Mr. ten Broeke. Mr. Sultana, short, because Mr. Van Bommel also has his second question still to go.
I think with hindsight, the risk was miscalculated. It happened. So either the probability of it happening, or certainly the probability and the means for it to happen, I think was misrepresented. And I think your report makes it, the Dutch safety report makes it clear that the fact that this could happen maybe was seen as remote because it had never happened before, and this was the one which had a determining factor in not giving it the right risk level, which would have triggered further actions. So yes, in hindsight, certainly the fact that it has happened, I think, has everybody needs to make the lessons from that and make sure that next time we also look at this.
What is this?
Thank you, Mr. Sultana. At least Mr. Van Bommel with his second question.
Yeah, what is it?
I look to the time, and I think we have to close at 7:50, so we have 6 minutes to go. Mr. Van Bommel.
Okay. My question would be related to information that could have been known with Eurocontrol but would not have been public knowledge. It's about the disturbance of communication between authorities related to using the airspace above Ukraine, especially eastern Ukraine. It is said that these disturbances of communication were known to organizations such as yours. Are you aware? Is that a fact that you were aware at the time or days before the incident happened that there was a disturbance on behalf of the separatists of communication between important airspace authorities and organizations?
Mr. Sultana?
No, I think, and I have promised also to provide the information to you of any information that we had received between April, May, June, July, of, for example, the radar outages that might have been impacted. We have had no information that the air traffic services and the ability of the Ukraine to provide a safe service was degraded in the months and the weeks before. But we will make available all the information that we have received.
Thank you.
I can tell you that there was no information that for us indicated that there was a degradation of the service that they could provide. And I think, if I may, I think the issue was not a reduction in the service, which caused the shooting down. It was the not, as said in the report, it was the misassessment of the risk that something such as shooting down an aircraft at 33,000 feet or whatever the flight level was there was a risk, such a high risk that could happen.
Okay, but still, a lack of information, of disturbance of communication could have been, in this case it wasn't, but it could have been part of your risk assessment had you known it.
Mr. Sultana?
If we had known, yes, if we had known, we would have used this information in our general assessment, such as we did, the example I previously made in the Crimea side, in the Crimea incident that was in April when they had communication issues and competing authorities trying to make traffic control, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Sultana. On behalf of the Dutch Parliament, I want to thank you for taking the time to answer the questions of the members. I think your participation was very helpful, and I wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Omtzigt, one remark from Mr. Omtzigt?
Yeah, we look forward to receiving the information.
Yes, of course, we have 3 months.
If that information were available before Wednesday evening, that would help us because we've got a debate on it on Thursday. If not, we also understand, but...
You will have, we will have, from our assistants, yeah, of course. From our assistants, we will take in contact, keep in contact with you, and I hope that you can try that we receive it within 4 or 5 days.
We'll do our best, certainly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sultana. Thank you. Goodbye.